gospel and a holding again at all times.
Be careful.
Government officials insist that these isolated entities get the package for him. But then, no perhaps we will continue to keep you informed of the story of
Robertson County, Tennessee, 1875. The Bell Witch had been quiet for decades. John Bell was in the ground. The farm had changed hands. The family had scattered to the wind. The witnesses were old men and old women telling stories to grandchildren who weren't sure what to believe. The county had moved on, or so it told itself. The truth was, Robertson County hadn't moved on at all. It had just stopped talking about it out loud. The fear was still there, woven into the fabric of the place the way smoke gets into wood. You couldn't see it, but on certain nights, in certain company, you could smell it. A man named Smith understood that. He arrived in the Red River area the way trouble usually arrives. Quietly, with no history anyone could verify and no family anyone could name. He found work on a farm, kept his head down, and then when he had figured out the shape of the place and the weight of what it carried, he started talking. He said he had abilities. He said he could bend a man's will, override it, reach into the space between a person's intentions and their actions and plant something there that wasn't theirs, just like conception. He said it didn't come from study or practice. He said it came from the Bell Witch. In most places, a claim like that gets a man laughed out of the county. This wasn't most places. Thomas Clenard and Richard Burgess heard him, and somewhere between hearing him and believing him, something broke loose in them that couldn't be put back. They became afraid. Not the kind of afraid that makes a man check the locks before he goes to bed. Not the kind that fades with daylight. This was the kind of afraid that Robertson County had been producing for 60 years. The kind that had no edge you could find and push back against, because it didn't come from outside you. It came from inside. That was what Smith had done to them, or what they believed he had done, which in Robertson County amounted to the same thing. He had gotten in, past the part of a man that reasons and resists and tells itself it's still in control. Past the part that says this is a trick, this is just a man with a loud mouth and borrowed reputation. Past all of it, down into the place where a person lives when they stop performing and start surviving. And once he was in there, they couldn't find him to remove him. They tried, the way men try when they don't have language for what's happening to them. By working harder, by staying busy, by telling themselves it would pass. It didn't pass. It deepened. Every morning they woke up a little less certain that the thoughts in their heads were their own. Every evening they went to bed with something sitting on their chest that hadn't been invited and wouldn't leave. They watched each other the way men watch when they're too ashamed to say what's actually wrong. And then at some point, that neither of them could have named precisely, the calculations changed. There was a man doing this to them. A physical man, a man who ate and slept and bled like any other man. A man who could be found and confronted and stopped in the way that the Bell Witch itself had never been stopped. Not by detectives, not by conjurers, nor by generals, because the Bell Witch had no body to put in the ground. But Smith, he did. They decided the only way out was through him. So Thomas and Richard killed him. The trial that followed was not like other trials. They didn't deny what they'd done. They explained it. They said Smith had placed them under his influence through witchcraft derived from the Bell Witch herself, that they had not been fully themselves, that what they did to survive something that couldn't be survived any other way. The jury listened, and then the jury agreed. A man was dead, the men that did it walked free, and the explanation that satisfied a court of law in 1875 was the same name that had terrorized a family 60 years prior. I spent a long time thinking about what that verdict means. It means the Bell Witch didn't need to be in the room anymore. It had already done its work. It had cracked something open in that community and left it open. And decades later, a man with no name and no history walked through the gap it had made and used what he found there to make two men afraid enough to kill. Some things leave a place when they're done with it, and some things leave something behind that does the work for them. Robertson County learned the difference the hard way.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Dancing Toaster. This is Pastor Nelly, and this is the place where we wrestle with the intersection of faith and the unexplained. Today is our much delayed, part 2 of the massive deep dive into the infamous case of the Bell Witch. I'm so sorry it took so very long. I hope you understand why. We had some unprecedented events to discuss, so we did that on Toaster Talk, but I also had multiple podcast appearances to be a part of. One with my dear brothers over on the Dangerous Info podcast, another with a new friend of the show. I'll be announcing that next week. That'll be a surprise. And of course, with somebody who had been listening for a while, and I didn't even know. A dear brother, pastor of Reclamation Church in Denver, Colorado, and one of the hosts over on Remnant Radio, Pastor Michael Miller. He invited me on to discuss my material on Lilith. I was so incredibly nervous, but it was such a blessing and an honor, and I know it's brought a ton of new listeners over to the Dancing Toaster. If that's you, welcome. Thank you for joining me. Over here, I don't expect you to agree with me on everything. That's one of the beauties of the body of Christ. Unity does not mean uniformity. I didn't come up with that, but it has stuck with me ever since I first heard it years ago. To my day ones, thank you so much for going on this crazy ride with me. We don't always agree, but we always show love and we always show respect to one another, and I love that. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sticking with me. I don't deserve you, but I love you. To my toasties, my patrons over on Patreon, thank you. I cannot thank you enough. I cannot forget about you, nor those of you that have blessed me up over on buymeacoffee.com. You help me to keep this crazy train a-moving, and I thank you all so very much. You could be listening to a million other things, but you're here, so I'm grateful. On a personal note, another thing that delayed the show the last 2 weeks was my new tiny friend. My wife and I rescued another pit bull, and he came from a horribly abusive hoarder home, and he has been an absolute handful, but he is one of the sweetest, most loving creatures I've ever met, and knowing what he's gone through, for him to be that loving still, oh man, it grabs my heart. It's why I love dogs more every day. His name is Rascal. His name is not false advertisement. Now that he's getting a little more comfortable, we're seeing his name is very fitting. He's a little brother to our other pit bull that we just recently rescued named Rosie. I hated being away from you guys and from the show this long, but he needed a lot of TLC, and I've had to work hard to get them to agree with one another and get along with each other. But I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's talk about the Bell Witch. When we last visited the Bell Farm, we spent a long time there. We covered the knocking that started it all, the escalation from sound to presence to voice, the targeting of Betsy Bell, the parade of investigators and conjurers and generals who allegedly came to solve it and left with more questions than answers. We ended having learned something painful, the death of John Bell, and the long, strange aftermath that followed a family that never asked for any of it. If you haven't heard part 1, I need you to go back and listen first. Normally I wouldn't say stop listening right now, but what we're doing today won't land the same without it. Today we're not telling the story anymore. Today we're asking what the story means. Because if what happened on that farm was real, then we're not dealing with a ghost story. We're dealing with something that looks a lot closer to what the Bible describes as unclean spirits. All right, it's time to talk about what happened. It's time to dig and examine the case from every angle, the original one and the weird murder case tied to it a half-century later. We'll ask the hard questions, we'll ask the weird questions, we'll also take the case to Scripture and see what it says about the potential happenings on the Bell Farm. Got a big surprise for you today as we go back to the Bell Farm. Rejoining me after a lengthy hiatus is our dear friend, ladies and gentlemen, the man whose eyes roll so far back in his skull he stares at his brain, Dr. Al B. Wright. Welcome back, Doc.
Well, at least I have a brain to stare at.
Ah, there it is, the insults to my intelligence. Oh, how I've missed you. So glad to have you back.
Back? I never left. You tried to replace me with Mr. T and Crumpets talking about that Harry Potter nonsense. I've been sitting here for the better part of 2 months listening to thousands of years of hogwash, and then you wasted my time with about 200 years of campfire stories dressed up as history. Can we address what this actually is before we go building a theological cathedral on a foundation of one man's diary that nobody ever even saw?
Whoa. Slow down. We're not even there yet. I didn't try to replace you with Professor Godfrey. He's helping me with a specific series, one we need to go back to, but I thought some breaks in between would do us some good and life be lifing, and man, things are just nuts in the world, but...
Whatever. You just wanted somebody on here who couldn't shut you down and who would agree with your foolishness.
What are you even talking about? We don't agree on everything. We agree in the possibility of many things, but we differ strongly on the sources and implications of those things.
Whatever. Can we move on from Professor Fairy Dust and just get on with debunking the witch?
You're awfully spicy today. You must have been fermenting this whole time. I think I got Vinny's number around here somewhere. Hold on.
Now, wait a minute. We don't need to go getting that weirdo on here. I'll reel it in. All right.
Oh, no. It's too late. Vinny, hey! Oh, so Toaster Boy does know how to use the phone. I got half a mind to hang up on you right now, leaving me on ice for 2 months.
Well, he is right about having half a mind.
Doc, shut up, Vinny. I'm sorry. What? You brought Pencil Neck on before me? Now I really ought to hang up. It's not like that, Vinny. It's not.
Oh, no, don't let us keep you. You're right. He's a jerk. You should hang up. You really should hang up.
Doc, if you don't shut up, I'll get Godfrey on here too. Oh, no, you don't. Professor Twinkletoes don't need no more airtime, all right? You guys really are crapping all over Godfrey. I didn't realize you were both so jealous.
No, we ain't.
I can always get y'all to agree on something. Anyways, both of you, shut up and welcome back. There's been a lot going on in the world and a lot going on with the show and with my life, but I'm glad you're both here, so let's dive in together. Shall we?
Fine.
Yeah, fine, whatever. First, Doc, you already took the first shot. Did any of this actually happen? I want to address this directly because you deserve honesty and because the sourcing problem in this case is real. The Bell Witch case rests almost entirely on 2 books. Richard Bell's Our Family Trouble, written in 1846, and Martin Van Buren Ingram's 1894 compilation. Researchers have noted that there are almost no independent contemporary records that predate Ingram. Sadly, there was no newspaper coverage of what was said to be a county-wide spectacle, and sadly no mention in Andrew Jackson's personal journals of a visit that, if it happened, would have been remarkable enough to write home about. Richard Bell's original diary, the supposed foundation of the whole account, has never been verified or seen by anyone outside the family.
Boom, right there. Thank you. Finally, the man admits it. The diary nobody's seen, the newspaper that didn't cover it, the general who somehow forgot to write it down, that he was talking to a ghost. This is all folklore. This is a Tennessee family that told stories around a fire and a man named Ingram who turned those stories into a book 40 years after most of the witnesses were dead.
Well, Doc, some scholars believe exactly that Ingram constructed large portions of the legend from local folklore, anchoring it to verifiable facts about the Bell family and expanding outward from there.
Good, so we agree.
We agree on the sourcing problem. We do not agree on what that means.
Of course we don't.
Take that, egghead.
Why did you have to call him?
Look, the man admits there's a sourcing problem, and Doc over here thinks he just won the Super Bowl. Congratulations, Doc, you found the gap in the paperwork. You know what else has gaps in the paperwork? The moon landing, the Kennedy assassination, the entire history of what the government has been doing in facilities nobody's allowed to visit. You think an absence of documentation means something didn't happen? That's not how it works. That's actually the opposite of how it works. The more something gets buried, the more something gets covered up. You know who keeps good records? People who want you to find them. You know who doesn't? People who don't.
That is not how historical scholarship...
And another thing. You're gonna sit there and tell me that dozens of people, neighbors, travelers, reverends, a man who fought the British all independently experienced the same thing, described the same thing, was shaken by the same thing, and your explanation is campfire stories? My Nona tells stories around the table every Sunday. Nobody walks away from a table unable to sleep. Nobody walks away from her carbonara and says, I would rather face the British again. There's a difference between a story and a testimony, Doc, and you know it.
Are you finished? Are you finished?
Yeah, I'm finished.
You sure? Because I want to make sure you're finished before I respond, because last time I thought you were finished and you weren't finished.
I said I'm finished.
All right, first of all, the moon landing happened, Vincent. Second of all, comparing the Bell Witch to the Kennedy assassination is exactly the kind of thing I'd expect from a man whose primary research facility is his grandmother's basement. Third, and I want you to listen carefully because I'm only going to say this once, the absence of documentation for an event that allegedly involved dozens of witnesses, countywide panic, and a visit from a future president of the United States is not a minor gap in the paperwork. That is the paperwork not existing. Those are different things. If Andrew Jackson had visited a haunted farm in Tennessee and had been run off before morning by a talking ghost, I promise you somebody would have written it down. The man wrote everything down. He was not a modest correspondent.
Unless they didn't want it getting out.
I'm not finished now, Vincent.
I'm sorry.
And as for your grandmother's carbonara, I have no doubt it's wonderful. I have no doubt people enjoy it very much. But the fact that nobody has said they'd rather face the British again after Sunday dinner does not constitute evidence of a supernatural haunting in Robertson County, Tennessee. That is not the bar we're setting here. That's not any bar. That is describing pasta.
You guys never cease to amaze. Here's where I land. It ain't on the moon. Vinny, let us talk, bro. Here's where I land on this event. The theological analysis we're going to do is valid whether this happened exactly as described, partially as described, or whether it's a story that emerged from a community grappling with real spiritual darkness and attached itself to a real family over time. Because the patterns in this account show up everywhere. They're in Scripture, they're in Harrisville, Rhode Island, they're in Oklahoma City in the 1980s with Darren Evans and Zozo. They're in accounts we've already walked through scene by scene over the last year and a half together. And most significantly, all the patterns from Robertson County were in Amherst with Esther Cox in our last major two-parter. If you haven't checked that out yet, you really should. Shameless plug. That took place over 1,000 miles northeast and just a few years after Mr. Smith's murder trial from our opener today. That was in 1875. The Great Amherst Mystery began around 1878. The parallels between Esther Cox and the Bell family are difficult to ignore once you start looking, and that case was highly documented. In both cases, the phenomenon began with sounds, knocking, scratching, unexplained movement, before escalating into something far more personal and targeted. In both cases, a specific individual became the primary focus of the entity's attention: Esther in Amherst, Betsy and John Bell in Robertson County, with the physical torment centered on that person in ways that observers could not explain. In both cases, the haunting drew in observers who left divided, some convinced, others unsettled and without answers despite extended observation. In both cases, the entity demonstrated knowledge it had no natural access to. It spoke when it chose and went silent when it chose, and seemed to feed on the attention and engagement of the people around it. In both cases, the people closest to the phenomenon paid a long-term personal price that outlasted the haunting itself. Esther spent years having her credibility questioned. Betsy Bell spent decades trying to put distance between herself and something she never asked to be a part of. And in both cases, the haunting eventually subsided without resolution, leaving behind only the residue of an answer. The answer that Robertson County and Amherst have been sitting with ever since. Something happened here. And here is where the Great Amherst Mystery becomes more than just a parallel. I think it becomes an argument. Because again, Amherst was well documented. Contemporaneously, newspaper coverage, a physician on record, multiple independent witnesses, some more credible than others, many of whom were not easily dismissed, and no shared motive to fabricate. Walter Hubble didn't write his account 40 years later from secondhand sources. He watched it happen. He spent extended time in the house and claimed to witness the activity firsthand. And what he watched happen looks in its essential shape almost identical to what the Bell family described in Robertson County half a century earlier. The knocking, the targeted individual, the physical torment, the entity's apparent awareness of who was watching and how to respond to them, the investigators who came in confidently and left confused. If you take Amherst seriously, even at a minimal level, you are left with a problem. Either a large number of people misinterpreted and amplified something natural in remarkably consistent ways, or you're dealing with a category of experience that doesn't fit neatly into material explanations. You have already conceded that something can enter a household, focus its attention on a specific person, resist every attempt to explain or expel it, and leave the people inside it permanently changed. And if that can happen in Amherst, Nova Scotia in 1878 with newspaper reporters and a doctor taking notes, then the burden of proof shifts. The Bell Witch is no longer asking you to believe something unprecedented. It is asking you to believe that something documented perhaps happened twice, and probably far more. We can't confirm the Bell Witch haunting the same way as Amherst, but there is precedent, and we're also going to see, like last time, the events are theologically coherent in ways that are hard to accidentally get right.
Or it's theologically coherent because the people writing it down were deeply religious and shaped the story to match their worldview. You ever think of that?
Oh, I have, and I'll come back to why I don't think that fully explains it. But for now, we're going to engage the claims as they've been preserved and let Scripture do its work on them as we go. Let's start with perhaps the hardest but most obvious question. What was the thing that tormented the Bell Farm? What was the Bell Witch? Let's start with the name itself, the Bell Witch. It feels like a severe haunting, but no one ever called it the Bell Ghost. That name creates problems the moment you press on it. Wait a minute. What if it's the ghost of a witch? Well, it never claimed to be a ghost, and a ghost, by the traditional definition, is the spirit of someone who has died. Kate Batts, the woman this entity claimed to be, at least at times, was alive when the haunting began and remained alive long after it ended. So, it was a witch? We're going to talk about this more later on, but suffice it to say for now, Kate Batts was never proven to be a witch by any standard of evidence the community could agree on. Okay, but Toaster Boy, listen to me for a second. The grudge, the brass pins, the eccentric reputation, the fact that she asked for the pins specifically and pins kept showing up sticking out of pillows in the Bell house. You just gonna wave all that away? My Nona says when something looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, you don't need a notarized affidavit. You know what I'm saying? The community didn't just make this up out of nowhere. They had reasons. And Vinny, you're not entirely wrong that the circumstantial case was compelling enough to circulate. The problem is it was never compelling enough to confirm. John Bell himself didn't believe Kate Batts was responsible for what was happening to him and his family. The woman denied it with an anger that people who knew her described as genuine, and the entity that accepted her name never actually claimed to be her in any verifiable sense. It simply didn't correct the record when the community handed it a convenient identity to hide behind. See, but that's suspicious in itself. Why wouldn't she deny it? Because denying it draws more attention. Classic misdirection. My cousin Sal does the same thing all the time. Doc, you want to weigh in here?
I want to weigh in on his cousin Sal, actually, because comparing a 19th century accusation of witchcraft to whatever your cousin Sal gets up to is not the analytical framework I would choose. The circumstantial case against Kate Batts is exactly that. Circumstantial. A grudge ain't evidence. Eccentric behavior ain't evidence, or you're guilty. Brass pins in a house where the primary accuser is a teenage girl experiencing what we are generously calling a haunting is not evidence. What the community had against Kate Batts was a story that fit, and stories that fit have been destroying innocent people's lives and reputations since long before Robertson County ever existed.
All right. That last part I'll give you for sure. So the circumstantial case against her, the grudge, the brass pins, the eccentric reputation, that was compelling enough to circulate, but never compelling enough to confirm. Again, not even John Bell himself believed it. But here's a detail that gets overlooked. If Kate Batts somehow was responsible for what happened on that farm, if a human being with access to occult power actually produced these phenomena, then what we are describing is a level of ability that no documented practitioner of witchcraft in recorded history has ever come close to demonstrating. The transatlantic reach we learned about, the simultaneous surveillance of an entire county, the alleged physical transformation of Dean, the knowledge of private conversations across impossible distances. If a witch did that, then the word witch is no longer big enough for what we're talking about. So the name Bell Witch is wrong in almost every direction you push it. It stuck not because it was accurate, but because it was available. And whatever was actually operating in that house has been hiding behind it ever since. Wait a minute. Actually gotta push back a teensy bit. You're asking whether a human being could do all that. The answer is obviously not. No human being does what happened on that farm. But that's not actually what the witch theory requires. Nobody in Robertson County was sitting around thinking Kate Batts personally flew to England and came back with a report. The way it worked, the way it always worked in every folk magic tradition my Nona ever talked about around the table is the witch ain't the power, the witch is the door.
She makes a deal. She opens something up, and whatever comes through that door brings the power with it. Kate Batts didn't have to be able to do any of that herself. She just had to be connected to something that could, which I hate to admit accidentally supports the direction I'm pretty sure Toaster Boy is going in. This means even if she's a witch, we're still talking about a demonic entity's involvement either way. Whether Kate did it herself, which she couldn't, or whether she opened the door and let something in that could, you still end up in the same place. Something not human was operating on that farm. I just think she might have been the one who invited it, just saying.
Man, I need a moment.
What's wrong with you?
Well, Dr. Wright, Vincent just made a coherent theological argument, and I think I need a moment to process that.
Ah, come on, cork it, Toaster Boy. You're already on thin ice because you put me on ice for 2 months.
Sounds like it'll be 2 more months before I hear the end of it. In any case, Vinny, you already brought it back to where I needed it to be. When considering the question of what was the Bell Witch, y'all knew this was coming. Demons or other worldly spirits would have had to be involved. Whether the evil spirits were acting independently or through an agent, due to the extreme nature of the phenomena described, the Kingdom of Darkness was most certainly involved.
Man, I hate it when you play the "it must have been a demon" card.
You're the one that brought it up.
I know, but I still don't like it.
You're not the only one, Vinny. Obviously, the easy answer is the Bell Witch is demonic, but I think that may be the floor, not the ceiling. That doesn't require it to be a demon ontologically, could be something higher up the chain. In any case, most of what this entity did fits squarely within what we know about the Kingdom of Darkness. And I don't say that as a dismissal, I say it as our starting point. Because the behavioral profile of what happened on that farm lines up with the biblical portrait of demonic activity in ways that are too specific and too consistent to wave away. Before we go further, I want to talk about Betsy. Because I think this detail gets lost in the larger story, and it really shouldn't. Betsy Bell was 12 years old when the disturbances began. She was the youngest in the household. And whatever this was, it centered on her early, and it stayed centered on her throughout. Hair pulled hard enough to leave marks, welts appearing with no visible cause. Witnesses described seeing her react as if struck when no one was around her. And then there were the smothering episodes. Shortness of breath, a crushing weight in her chest, her body going completely limp while she was otherwise in perfect health, no medical explanation, coming and going without warning. There's something else about those episodes that I don't think gets enough attention. The one consistent pattern observers noted was that the entity went silent while Betsy was in one of these states. They waited. Only once she came back to herself would the voice begin again.
Wait a minute. Where you going with this?
He's saying she might have been the source of the deception.
No, Doc, though I think there were plenty of folks at the time that may have thought that but didn't say it out loud.
Yeah, Doc, they had a little more tact than some.
I just tell it like it is, Vincent.
Anyways, what I'm suggesting is, whatever this was, perhaps it was using Betsy.
Do you mean kind of like that slave girl in the Book of Acts?
Vinny, bud, you're killing it today. The smothering episodes weren't random. They weren't side effects. The timing suggests something deliberate, something that knew when she was incapacitated, stood down, and resumed only when she had recovered enough to experience what came next.
Yo, that's sick. She was just a kid.
Sadly, Vinny, that's kind of the point. Historically and biblically, it appears that many of these entities attack the most vulnerable among us.
In this case, it's hard to tell if this was the cruelty of something that wanted to destroy or the cruelty of something that wanted an audience.
Those aren't mutually exclusive, Vinny, but I think if it can't do one, it'll settle for the other. In Job, regardless of one's view of Hasatan or the adversary, we see God establishing limits to what that entity could do to Job and when. That gets theologically heavy real quick, but for the sake of discussion here, I don't think that death is always the desired outcome for these entities.
Now hold on there. The Bible says that the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy.
Well, even so, Doc, why steal from someone if the plan is solely to kill them? If you kill them, what is left to destroy? I'm saying death isn't the only goal, and often not the most useful one. In the beginning of John 10:10, Jesus says the thief comes that he might steal and kill and destroy. Klepse, thyse, apollose. Steal, take what gives life meaning, peace, and stability. Kill, bring actual death or the collapse of something vital. Destroy, leave something in a state of ruin, distortion, or lasting damage. If the end game is destruction, then death can actually be limiting, not maximizing. A dead person is gone. A ruined person is still there, still thinking, still influencing others, and still carrying damage forward. If the goal was simply death, you wouldn't need the rest of it. But the pattern Jesus describes is comprehensive. It doesn't just end life, it empties it, distorts it, and leaves something behind that continues to unravel. Apolisei, destroy, doesn't just mean physical annihilation. It can mean ruin, loss, being rendered useless, or being cut off. We could preach a whole sermon off that one word. When you read destroy as ruin, loss, being rendered useless or cut off, the story stops looking like a failed attempt at killing and starts looking like a very effective campaign of damage. Think about what actually happened to Betsy. She becomes the focal point for long stretches of time. Her life gets interrupted and redirected constantly. It was defined by something she didn't choose. Engagement broken, reputation shaped by the event. That's not annihilation, that's disruption and redirection, which fits ruin far more precisely than kill. The household itself got turned inside out. What should have been a place of stability became a place of fear and unpredictability. Nights were not restful, privacy was gone, authority structures in the home get undermined by a voice that inserted itself into everything. That's a family being rendered functionally unstable, not eliminated. Then there's the public dimension of it all. The Bell home became a spectacle. Visitors came, stories spread, credibility got tangled up with curiosity and skepticism. Even after the activities subsided, the name Bell was no longer just a family name. It's attached to something strange, something people don't quite know how to categorize. That's a kind of long-term reputational distortion. And maybe most interesting, the aftermath doesn't resolve cleanly. There's no clear explanation, no closure, no restoration moment where everything is put back the way it was. What was left was kind of a residue, a story that lingered, a community that carried it, a family that had to live with it. That's where Apolisei really lands, not just ending a life, but leaving something in a diminished state. Not just killing, but cutting something off from what it was supposed to be. If destroy just meant death, then the Bell Witch case ends with John Bell, but it doesn't, because what happened there didn't just take a life. It bent a family. It marked a name. It left behind something that didn't go back to normal. And it rippled because it led to madness and murder half a century later. At the Bell farm, this wasn't indiscriminate destruction. This was targeted. It was very personal. There was something in the kingdom of darkness that didn't just want to harm, it wanted to be experienced harming. Any other thoughts, Doc, before we move on?
Look, I don't have a naturalistic explanation for the timing of those episodes. I'll be honest about that. A child faking smothering attacks with that level of consistency over months in front of multiple witnesses with the voice patterns synced to her recovery, that's not a hoax anatomy I can reconstruct.
Man, both of y'all are just shocking me left and right today.
Shut up. I said I didn't have an explanation. I didn't say you were right.
Look, I'll take whatever I can get at this point. Let's move on to something equally as disturbing. Let's talk about the knowledge this thing was said to have had. This entity, according to the accounts, knew things it had no business knowing. Private conversations, held miles away, repeated back with precision. 2 sermons being preached simultaneously, 13 miles apart, reproduced word for word. Wait a minute. We've been leaning into a whole demonic angle, playing devil's advocate, pun intended. Why would a devil want to do that? Quote scripture or repeat sermons? Ain't that a bit counterintuitive to you? Not at all, actually. First, the witnesses did say it was repeated back in an unsettling manner, so out the gate edification did not seem to be the goal of the repeating of verses and sermons. I think it was more about the spectacle of it all. But we also have biblical precedent. Satan and his minions know the Bible better than we do. Look no further than the temptation of Christ in Matthew 4. Satan didn't fumble through the scriptures. He quoted them precisely and strategically. He knew exactly which passages or parts of passages to pull and how to twist them just enough to make destruction look like wisdom. That's the greater danger. It was never about whether the words were accurate. It was about the intent behind them. A counterfeit doesn't have to be sloppy to be false. In fact, the most effective ones are nearly flawless. The unsettling feeling the witnesses described wasn't coincidental. That unease was likely discernment doing its job. Scripture even warns us in 2 Corinthians 11:14 that Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. So why would we expect his influence to show up looking obviously dark and wrong? It will often show up looking almost right, familiar, even anointed on the surface, but leaving you feeling hollow, uneasy, or confused rather than built up. And that right there is the test. True edification leaves you feeling closer to God, more grounded in truth, more at peace. The spectacle may dazzle the crowd, but it won't feed the sheep. This thing was also said to speak the thoughts of visitors before they'd spoken them out loud.
Whoa, what's the book say on that one?
What do you mean?
Can, demons, read our thoughts?
I'll be honest with you, Vinny, I'm not clear on that one. I know that fiery arrows that Paul warns about in Ephesians land in the mind. I know they often know which arrows to shoot at who and when. Is that because they can see into our minds, or is it simply because they are masters of human behavior?
Wait a minute, what are you talking about?
They've had thousands of years to observe us. Imagine an evil spirit with thousands of years of people watching who spent decades in this little village. We've already brought up the demonized slave girl from Acts 16. Her predictions were accurate, which is how she made her masters money. Was this because the Spirit gave her insight into people's minds, or was it because the Spirit would leave the girl and be a fly on the wall for every villager, giving her spiritual intel that she could use to separate her customers from their shekels? I tend to lean toward the latter, and the next crazy thing the Bell Spirit did tied right into that.
What are you talking about? How so?
Well, Vinny, by crossing the Atlantic, we learned about a man that visited from England. This spirit at times would relay messages throughout the village, again further proving my theory, but with the guy from England, he wanted to test the limits of this thing. He allegedly sent and received a message from his family across the pond. They were all dead wrong for playing games with the spirit like this, I'll be clear, but if this account is true, it ties into my theory. A malevolent spirit could easily travel there and back. The mechanism by which it would do this is purely speculative, but it's not unreasonable to see it zooming over the Atlantic, or perhaps even opening a portal from the farm to where the man's family was in England.
All right, this is getting downright stupid.
All we're doing is speculating on how these entities might travel. We don't know how they traverse through their realm, nor do we know how they traverse through ours when they're in it. And Daniel 10...
Not Daniel 10 again. You ran that thing in the ground.
What? You always want to see these things from the Bible. That's where you always try to go first. That ain't in the Bible.
Now, wait a minute. I don't sound like that.
We'll agree to disagree. But in Daniel 10, Daniel is praying and God dispatches an angel with a message for Daniel. We're told it was held for 21 days by a malevolent entity called the Prince of Persia. It then tells Daniel that Michael the Archangel had to come help it get free before it could bring the message to Daniel. Somewhere, somehow, it was on its way from God to Daniel and was intercepted and contained for 3 weeks. This is how we know the passage isn't talking about a human ruler, because a human ruler couldn't contain one of God's holy messengers. Point being, they gotta get around, and we know not how.
Yo, do you think this little detour has something to do with UAPs?
Oh, Vinny, my man, I absolutely think the two may be related, but that's something we'll leave to look at another time. Demons are real. They are intelligent, and they have been around for a very long time. There is nothing in Scripture that places hard limits on their observational capacity. They know things. They travel. They listen. They watch. But what these accounts describe wasn't just knowing your secrets. It was operating across enormous distances, apparently simultaneously, monitoring an entire county, visiting England, coming back to report it. That suggests something with either extraordinary reach or significant resources, or maybe both. Whatever the accounts describe, it wasn't a corner spirit rattling pipes in a basement. Before we talk any more about what this thing did with that knowledge it gathered in public, I want to sit with what it did with it in private. Because there's something in those accounts that I think gets swallowed by the bigger, more dramatic details, and it's this. There was no private moment in that house that belonged only to the people in it. Not the conversations before sleep. Not the words spoken under your breath crossing a field. Not what you whispered to your wife in the dark when you thought everyone else was asleep.
Yo, that's a specific kind of violation. That's not the same as being overheard in a crowd.
It's certainly not. A crowd can be avoided. A public gathering can be skipped. You cannot avoid your own bedroom. You cannot unsay what you whispered to your spouse before the lights went out, and whatever was in that house knew those things, and at some point every person living under that roof knew that it knew.
Which means at some point you stop having private thoughts, or you start performing even your private moments because you're aware of the audience.
That's exactly right. And I want to tie that back to something in Scripture we keep mentioning that illuminates what I think we're dealing with here. Again, this pattern of a spirit obtaining and exploiting intimate knowledge is not unique to Robertson County. It was also found in Philippi in Acts 16. The demonized slave girl there had what the text called a pneuma pythona, a python spirit, known by many as a spirit of divination. She followed Paul through the city for days, crying out that he and his companions were servants of the Most High God who proclaimed the way of salvation.
Which was true, right? I mean, she wasn't saying anything wrong.
She wasn't. This is why I wanted to go back there. Just like the Bell entity going and repeating scripture and sermons, the spirit possessing the Philippian girl was speaking accurate information. It knew who Paul was. It knew what he was doing. It knew enough truth to be useful, and again, that usefulness was exactly what made her owners wealthy. People paid for access to what the spirit knew. Fortune-telling, private information, hidden things brought to light for a price. Her owners were profiting from whatever this thing could access and reveal, and Paul, after days of this, turned around and cast the spirit out, and the text makes a point of telling us that her owners were furious because their source of income had just left.
Which tells us something about what the spirit was actually doing, right? I mean, it wasn't helping her, it wasn't helping the people who paid for the readings, it was serving the people who owned her, and it was serving whatever agenda the spirit itself had, right? The people getting the information thought they were the beneficiaries.
But they weren't. That's the model. That's how it works. The appearance of supernatural knowledge sharing offered in ways that seem useful or impressive that actually serve the entity's purposes. The people receiving this information think they're getting something, but they're being used.
All right, I'll buy it. So how does this connect back to Robertson County? Nobody was selling access to the Bell Witch. Or Betsy.
No, but the dynamic is the same in reverse. In Acts 16, the Spirit's knowledge was being used to generate wealth and influence for its handlers. At the Bell Farm, there were no handlers. The Spirit was operating independently, which means the intimate knowledge it gathered, the bedroom whispers, the road conversations, the private words between husbands and wives, it wasn't being sold, it was being held.
As leverage.
As leverage, indeed. Or as ammunition, or simply as demonstration, proof of penetration, proof that nothing in that household was beyond its reach. You don't have to use every piece of information you have. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people know you have it. Once that awareness settles into a household, it doesn't need to do anything else to maintain control. The surveillance itself is the weapon. The knowledge that it's watching is enough. That is not a ghost story. That is a portrait of something that understood human psychology with the precision of something that has been studying it for a very, very long time. It targeted the Bells, but it affected the whole community. But here's what bothers me more than the reach. It's not just that it knew things. It's what it did with the things it knew. Again, sermons preached earlier that day in distant churches recited back word for word, but with the meaning quietly inverted. Private conversations repeated in front of a room full of witnesses. What you said on the road, what you whispered to your wife, things villagers said in confidence in passing, things you probably forget you'd even said, brought out in public, in front of your neighbors, twisted just enough to land differently than you intended. A special kind of nastiness. That's not just knowing things. That's knowing which things to use and when. That's the distinction I want to make, because a lot of people hear it knew private conversations and file it under supernatural party tricks. Impressive, strange, hard to explain, but ultimately just a demonstration of reach. More than mere demonstration. Folks, that's strategy.
It's also, and I don't love saying this, it's also quite effective. If you're in a room and something starts airing your private business in front of everyone you know, you're not thinking so clearly no more after that. You're on defense, you're ashamed, you're scared. You're not asking hard questions about what this thing actually is.
You just described a control mechanism.
I did, didn't I?
The community came to understand gradually that there was no secret it couldn't access, and once that understanding settled in, something changed. It wasn't just that people were afraid of being hurt, they were afraid of being known, of being exposed, of having the wrong thing said about them in the wrong room at the wrong moment. It marked them, so much so, 50 years later, a guy claimed to have that same power from the same entity, and 2 men were afraid enough to take his life. Whether you think the entity was real or not, its effect was very real. This is a qualitatively different kind of fear than what you feel when something knocks on your wall at night. Nocturnal sounds are frightening, but the fear of exposure, of your private self being dragged into public without your consent, that goes somewhere much deeper. That touches shame. And shame, unlike fear, doesn't go away when the lights come on. We're describing a community that's been psychologically destabilized, even if half the accounts are exaggerated. Even if you throw out Ingram entirely, the social effect we're describing was real. A community that believes nothing is private stops functioning the way a community should. Trust breaks down. People stop talking to each other honestly. They start performing. And that's exhausting. Side note, spirits aside, this is current communist China. And whether you're willing to admit it or not, it's also the future that Trump is helping Mr. Teal and Mr. Anderson secure for us through Palantir. But I'll save that for some toaster talk. But all of this is exactly what the enemy produces wherever he operates. Not just damage, division, isolation, the severing of the bonds that hold people together and what make them harder to pick off individually.
Look, I'm not conceding a theological point, but the social psychology of what you're describing is documented. This is what happens to communities under sustained surveillance, real or perceived. The behavior changes regardless of whether the watcher is real.
I think here the Watcher was very real, and it wasn't surveilling to gather information. It already had the information. It was surveilling to let everyone know it had the information. The manipulation and exposure were the point. The audience and the fear were the point. That tells us something about what this was. Something that feeds on humiliation. Something that doesn't just want to know you, it wants to reduce you. To take what is private and sacred about a person and make it small and public and available to ridicule. That is not random cruelty, that is a very old and very specific kind of evil. But the knowledge didn't only function as a weapon, and I think we have to be honest about that because the analysis so far is focused on what the entity did with the information when it wanted to harm. There are accounts in this record where it did something different, where the same reach, the same surveillance, the same capacity to be anywhere and know anything was deployed in a way that looked on the surface like care. The first is Jesse Bell. Lucy expressed worry one evening about him being overdue from a trip, and the entity told her to wait a moment, that it would go check on him. A couple of minutes passed. The voice came back and reported that Jesse was safe at his home, reading a book by candlelight. When Jesse visited the next morning and was told what had happened, he confirmed it. He added that during his reading, he heard a knock at his door. Before he could get up to answer it, the door opened and quickly closed again. When his wife asked what he thought it was, he said he reckoned it was the witch. It actually went. It actually checked. And it came back with an accurate report that was independently confirmed.
Yo, I don't like this. I'm not entirely sure where to file that, Toaster Boy.
Neither did Robertson County, I suspect. And I want to connect this to the cave rescue we learned about last time, because these two moments form a pattern the analysis has to reckon with honestly. The entity pulled a suffocating child from the mud. The entity went to check on a worried mother's son and came back with a true report. Both times the beneficiary was someone vulnerable. Both times the action looked like something a protector would do rather than something a tormentor would do. And both times, if you look at what surrounded those moments, the entity had been tormenting that same household for years. The cave rescue created a debt the community couldn't name. The Jesse Bell account gave Lucy something she needed in a moment of genuine fear. And both of those gestures came from the same thing that was systematically destroying her husband in the next room. But once again, Paul tells the Corinthians in his second letter that Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. Not that he occasionally pretends to be harmless, not that he dresses up his cruelty in palatable language, that he presents himself as a source of genuine illumination, genuine help, genuine good. The masquerade is the strategy. The kindness was yet another weapon.
Wait a minute. You're just saying a Jesse Bell account and a cave rescue aren't evidence against the demonic identification? They're more evidence for it?
That's exactly right. A demon that never did anything that looked like good would be recognizable. A demon that pulled your child out of the mud and checked on your son when you were worried and then sang at your husband's funeral. That is something much harder to name clearly and much harder to refuse. Whatever it was presenting itself as, it was presenting itself as ancient. At one point, it said its hope for happiness had passed hundreds of years ago. It described watching empires it claimed to have witnessed firsthand. It wasn't reciting theology, it was describing experience.
But wait a minute. You still haven't said what you thought this thing was. Are we talking fallen angel? We talking demon?
Those are the same thing.
No, I don't think they are, Doc, but in any case, what if the Bell Witch was neither?
Oh, wait a minute, what are you talking about? I thought you just spent an hour convincing me it was a demon.
I've said it was demonic. I'm not sure if it was a demon in the traditional sense or something else. After my time with Michael Miller on Remnant Radio, I re-released my episodes on female demonic entities and Lilith specifically. We've talked about the spirits of the deceased Nephilim as one of the primary sources of what we understand as demons, what the New Testament called unclean spirits, what Enoch called bastard spirits. But in that episode, we talked about the women involved in the Genesis 6 event that produced the Nephilim. During the Second Temple period, people thought these women were changed by their improper mixing and that they became something else, what some ancient texts and some biblical passages point toward as siren-like entities, feminine in character, ancient beyond measure, deeply knowledgeable about human beings because they were present at the beginning of human civilization. I'm not saying definitively that's what the Bell Witch was, but the profile in these accounts fits in uncomfortable ways. Feminine identity consistently maintained, ancient self-description, even how it targeted Betsy's breathing.
Hey, didn't that remnant guy talk about that?
Yes, Vinny. Michael said he encountered a Lilith-like entity that was obstructing a woman's breathing, and when he rebuked that specific spirit from the woman, her breathing was restored. On top of that, you have the specific treatment of Lucy Bell. Warmth, tenderness, a parting gift, in contrast to the systematic destruction of John and the torment of Betsy.
Now hold on there. If it hates men and loves women, why hurt Betsy?
It hates authority and targets vulnerability. Targeting a child is further evidence of the Lilith motif, but even tenderness toward a mother while targeting a child. Perhaps it hates that its children were destroyed, so it seeks to destroy the children of others. Perhaps it has some sympathy toward the mother. Or perhaps they're merely trying to masquerade once again as beings of light. But that claim that its hope for happiness had passed hundreds of years ago, if true, if I'm correct, well, that's even more chilling, isn't it? Whatever this thing was presenting itself as, it was old. Much older than Kate Batts, much older than Robertson County, older than the United States itself. Now on that note, I want to be honest about one specific detail in that self-description because it deserves scrutiny. It said it had been created millions of years ago. That is the quote, as preserved, and the first question any careful reader should ask is, does that language belong to 1817 or to 1894?
Now, I'm glad you brought that up because I was gonna. Darwin published in 1859, Ingram published in 1894. By the time Ingram is writing, deep time is culturally present. Millions of years is a concept that educated people in 1894 were beginning to be familiar with. So when a supernatural entity in Ingram's book conveniently claims to be millions of years old, you have to ask whether that language is coming from 1817 or from the man writing it down in 1894.
That is a legitimate question, and I'm not going to wave it away. The concept of deep geological time was beginning to circulate in scientific circles during the Bell's era through figures like James Hutton and Charles Lyell, but it had not reached a frontier farming community in Robertson County, Tennessee. It was not common language in 1817. If any witnesses heard those words come out of that house, the phrase millions of years would have been genuinely disoriented in a way it simply wouldn't have been by the time Ingram committed it to print.
So either the entity said something genuinely ahead of its cultural moment, or Ingram put words in its mouth that fit his era better than the Bell's.
I'd rather sit with that honestly than pretend the problem isn't there, but here's where it gets more interesting, because there are actually 3 possibilities on the table, not 2.
Wait, go ahead.
The first is what you said. Ingram shaped the language to fit 1894. The second is that the account is accurate and the entity said something genuinely outside the cultural framework of everyone in that room in 1817. But the third possibility is the one I want to sit with for a moment.
Which is...
What if the quote is accurate? What if those words were actually spoken in that house in 1817, and the claim of millions of years wasn't a reflection of scientific knowledge at all, but a deliberate seed?
Wait a minute. What are you talking about?
Darwin published in 1859. Whatever was in that house made its claim roughly 40 years before on the origin of species, decades before deep time entered popular consciousness. And what did it claim? That it was ancient beyond measure, that it had watched civilizations rise and fall, that the world was older than anyone in that room had a framework to understand.
Now hold on, you're suggesting the entity was front-running Darwinism?
I'm suggesting that the kingdom of darkness has a vested interest in convincing human beings that they are the product of an ancient, impersonal process rather than the intentional creation of a personal God. That is not a modern agenda. If these beings are as old as Scripture suggests, if they were present at creation, if they watched the world come into existence, then the idea of deep time is not something they discovered. It is something they know. It is something they have every reason to want us to believe in a way that displaces the Creator.
That's a significant theological leap.
It's a theological inference. Consider what Genesis 1 establishes and what Darwinian evolution attempts to dismantle. Not just the mechanism of creation, but the relationship. If you are made by a personal God in His image for a specific purpose, you have inherent dignity, inherent accountability, and inherent belonging to something larger than yourself. If you are the product of millions of years of impersonal selection, you have none of those things by default. You are an accident that got lucky. I'm saying the enemy has always preferred any story that severs human beings from their identity as image bearers of Yahweh. And a claim of millions of years spoken in a farmhouse in Tennessee in 1817 by something that identified itself as ancient and everywhere and uncreated by any god, that is either a remarkable coincidence or it is exactly the kind of long game that Scripture warns us the enemy plays. But we still have too much to talk about. Now let's discuss the so-called prophecies. The sourcing problem is very real here. The accounts record that this entity made predictions about future wars, the abolishment of slavery, global conflict on a scale the world had never seen, and eventually a world becoming too hot for human beings to survive, followed by a mighty explosion.
Ingram published in 1894. The Civil War was over, done. He could have put anything in John Jr.'s mouth and called it prophecy. This is the oldest trick in the book. Write the prediction after the thing already happened.
That's the honest problem, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The Civil War prediction had already come true by the time it appeared in print. The World War predictions could have been shaped by the intellectual climate of the late 19th century, when European tensions were already building. When we're dealing with accounts that only appear in print after many of the predicted events had already occurred, retroactive shaping is a real possibility, not a certainty, but a possibility we can't dismiss.
So we actually agree here?
I think we do.
Oh man, I'll mark my calendar.
As you should. One more note about these alleged prophecies. The prediction about the Earth becoming too hot for human beings to exist and a mighty explosion following, that one is harder to explain as 1894 retrofitting. This crazy idea wouldn't come until much, much later, but it certainly is evil in origin. The Bible gives us a clear picture of the end, and climate change ain't it. Not to mention all climate change activity has been used by psychos and wannabe despots to control every aspect of human existence. We're gonna control your food, your car, your house, your money, and we're gonna fill the sky with crap we're not gonna tell you about because we gotta control climate change. Enjoy the bugs. That's the only thing that might have actually come from the demonic Bell Witch prophecies. Now I think we need to go back to Kate. I want to make sure we cover all our bases there. The entity accepted the label of Kate Batts without resistance. It picked it up and ran with it. And before we talk about what that means theologically, I want to talk about who Kate Batts actually was, because she deserves that much. Kate Batts was not an abstraction. She was a real woman who lived nearby. Her husband, Frederick, had become disabled, leaving her to manage the household alone. All her children had died young. She was labeled eccentric. She was known to speak harshly about John Bell. There had been some dispute between them years earlier, and she had reportedly declared she would get even with him.
So boom, right there, she had motive, at least on paper.
On paper, for sure. She also had a habit that the superstitious of Robertson County found difficult to ignore. She would ask women for their brass pins. The folk belief being that when someone gave Kate a pin, it gave her power over them. And brass pins had been found at the Bell house, sticking from pillows left on chairs. Betsy had described being poked by something that felt exactly like that.
So you got a woman with a grudge, eccentric behavior, a folk magic association, and physical evidence that seemed to connect her to the house. I can see why the community landed there.
Which is exactly the point. The name didn't stick because people were foolish. It stuck because it fit. Kate Batts was the answer that already existed before anyone went looking for one. The community didn't construct a case against her from nothing. They assembled what was already present, and the entity handed them the confirmation they were already waiting for.
Yo, bro, that's cold. That's a real woman's life.
It is. Or it was. The real Kate Batts denied any involvement with anger that those who remembered her described as sincere. We've said several times that John Bell himself didn't believe that she was responsible. There is no reliable evidence that ever tied her to the events at the farm beyond the Voice's own agreement, and yet her name became permanently attached to one of the most infamous hauntings in American history. She carried that for the rest of her life. She didn't choose it. She couldn't escape it, and the thing that gave her that name knew exactly what it was doing. Because if people are focused on Kate Batts,
then they ain't focused on what's actually in the house.
Exactly. That is the move I want you to see clearly. The entity didn't correct the record. It didn't protest. It accepted an identity that gave the community a target they could understand, local, human, explainable, already half suspected, and in doing so it redirected every conversation, every investigation, every prayer meeting away from itself and toward a woman who had no defense against it. She was another victim. Create confusion, deflect attention, let human fear and suspicion do the work for you. Let a community spend its energy on the wrong target while the actual thing operating in that house stayed unidentified and unconfronted. We saw something similar in Harrisville over a year ago with the episode on The Conjuring. People spent years thinking they were dealing with Bathsheba Sherman when Bathsheba Sherman most likely had nothing to do with any of it. The real entity got to operate from behind a mask. Some were asking about my episode. Who cares about naming or identifying any of these things? I do. I didn't before, but I do now. A lot of exorcistic material centers around naming. Name a thing accurately, and you can engage it. Name it incorrectly, and you're swinging at air. And whatever was in that house made absolutely certain that Robertson County was swinging at air for as long as it possibly could. Kate Batts paid the price for that. She didn't owe it.
Now look, I already think this has gone on far too long, but there's one thing you haven't even hinted at. Why John Bell? Why on earth, if some ancient demonic entity was to target anybody, would it target a little old farmer?
That's a great question, Doc. Why John Bell? This is the question that haunted Robertson County and has haunted everyone who's engaged this story since. The entity declared it was determined to torment John Bell to death. and it never said why. Not once in years of recorded interaction did it ever offer a reason. It never accused him of wrongdoing. It never tried to turn the community against his character. It just hated him. Fixed, unconditional, sourceless hatred.
Kate Batts. Land dispute, old grudge. There's your reason. Some woman with a grievance used superstition and a credulous community to destroy a man's reputation and his health. Psychosomatic illness is real. If everyone around you believes you're cursed, your body starts cooperating.
Part of me wants to agree with you, Doc, but there are just too many other things. Plus, we've already established that Kate Batts had nothing to do with it. And psychosomatic illness doesn't explain a vial of unknown substance found in a place of the medicine, a cat dying from a test dose of it, and a bodiless voice singing cheerfully at a man's funeral.
Oh, come on. The vial is Ingram. The cat is Ingram. The funeral singing is Ingram.
Look, I've already acknowledged the sourcing problem, but theologically the pattern matters regardless of whether every detail is accurate, because that pattern appears in Scripture in an uncomfortable book we've already mentioned today. In Job, Hasatan asks permission to afflict a righteous man. God grants it. The affliction was severe. The reason wasn't given to Job for most of the book. The suffering was very real. The man targeted was not uniquely guilty. And the purpose, from Job's vantage point, is completely opaque.
Oh, come on. You're not actually comparing John Bell to Job.
I'm not drawing a direct parallel. I'm not saying God authorized what happened at that farm, but I'm saying that the pattern of a specific focused, seemingly sourceless spiritual attack on a righteous man is not without biblical precedent. The fact that the entity never provided a reason doesn't mean there wasn't one. It may mean the reason was above John Bell's pay grade. It may also mean it's above ours. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9, I keep coming back to it the last year and a half. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. There are things that happen in the spiritual world that we are not equipped to fully understand from where we're standing. The Bible also says in Deuteronomy, the secret things belong to the Lord. None of these are cop-outs, honest acknowledgement of the limits of human perspective when it comes to the operations of a spiritual universe we only see partially.
Now, what about his son? What about John Jr. over there? Why didn't this thing hate him like it hated his pops, or how it hated Betsy?
What about John Jr. is another hard question. The relationship between this entity and John Bell Jr. is one of the strangest details in the entire case, and also one of the least verifiable, coming as it does from the furthest end of the oral tradition chain.
Least verifiable, most convenient. The one member of the household it never hurt, the one it supposedly respected and confided in, and that information comes from his own descendants. You see how that works, right?
I do see how it works, and I'm not asking you to take it as settled history. But with that caveat clearly on the table, what the accounts describe is an entity that never harmed him, respected him, told him things it didn't tell anyone else, and admitted to him that it had no happiness and never had. It told him he would never know it to lie to him.
Demons lie, that's their whole thing.
Usually, but there's something in this specific exchange that doesn't fit the standard template. Demons don't typically make peace with the people who challenge them. They don't offer something approaching honest vulnerability to someone who calls them a spirit of the damned.
Unless that's exactly what the account was designed to do, give the Bell family a heroic figure. John Jr. gets the wisdom scenes. How convenient.
Maybe. Or if this thing was as ancient as it claimed, if it had watched civilizations rise and fall, if it had long ago lost any hope of happiness, there's something in what the accounts describe that reads less like a confrontation and more like something very old and very weary, speaking to one of the few people who would engage it without flinching. That doesn't make it safe. The enemy is described in Scripture as a deceiver above all things, and we should never forget that. But the complexity of that relationship, as the tradition preserves it, refuses to fit neatly into our categories. I think we have to be honest about that. 1 John 4:1 says, "Do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God." John Jr., by what the accounts describe, applied something like that instinctively. He didn't accept the entity's self-presentation at face value. He engaged it critically, held it accountable, and refused to be manipulated by it. And it responded to that with something resembling respect, for lack of a better word. But there's one moment in the John Jr. accounts that deserves its own treatment, and I think it's the most important detail in their entire relationship. After John Bell Sr.'s death, John Jr. confronted the entity again, condemned his father's death, condemned the years of persecution that had led to it, and the entity, in what reads as a genuine attempt at comfort, told him that John Sr. now saw each day what his children were doing and was at peace with the prospect of their future happiness.
Which is exactly what a grieving son would want to hear.
Exactly what a grieving son would want to hear. And John Jr. said he could not be happy after what had been done, and that the entity said it understood, and that it told him to look out the window. There were no tracks in the snow. Now observe, it said he watched as tracks appeared leading toward the window, formed as if by heavy boots. It told him to check his father's old boots from the back porch to see if they fit, but he didn't check. He didn't need to.
Because the implication was already there. His father's ghost walking toward the window to check on his children.
That's the implication the tracks were designed to produce. And in 1820 in Robertson County, Tennessee, in a household that had just buried its patriarch after years of supernatural torment, that implication would have landed with devastating force. A grieving family seeing those tracks, drawing that conclusion that John Sr. was still there, still watching, still present in some form, would have provided exactly the kind of comfort that keeps people coming back for more, that opens doors, that creates dependence.
And the entity didn't use it?
The entity didn't use it. It disclosed it. It told John Jr. unprompted that it had not made those tracks to suggest his father was contactable from beyond death, that it found such ideas foolish, that it had no intention of encouraging them. It had made the tracks to show John Jr. that it could manufacture whatever impression it wanted about what lies on the other side of death, and it had chosen with him not to.
That sounds kind of like a confession.
It does sound like a confession, and I want to sit with what it's confessing to, because this is not an abstract theological point. This entity is describing its own operational method in the domain of communication with the dead. It can produce the tracks, it can produce the voices, it can produce the impression, convincing, emotionally overwhelming, apparently confirmed by physical evidence that a dead person is present and communicating. And it is telling John Jr. that everything produced in that space is manufactured, that it is the one doing the manufacturing, that the comfort people receive from those experiences is a comfort that has been constructed for its own purposes.
Yo, that's an indictment of the entire spiritualist movement from the thing that runs it.
Exactly, straight from the thing that runs it. The Fox sisters would formalize spirit communication into a system less than 30 years after this conversation supposedly took place. The seance, the medium, the message from the departed, the knocking that answers questions, the voice that sounded like someone you've lost, all of it, if this entity's confession is accurate, all of it is this. Tracks in the snow made to produce an impression, used to keep the grieving coming back and opening forbidden doors and seeking more.
And the entity told John Jr. this voluntarily?
If the record is true, yes, voluntarily, without being pressed, in the context of a relationship it had committed to be honest within. Which means one of two things. Either it was telling him the truth because he had earned that from it, and it had decided to honor that commitment even when the truth was damaging to its own interests, or it was telling him something that sounded like a confidence while still serving a purpose we can't fully see. Again, 1 John 4:1, do not believe every spirit, test the spirits. Even this moment of apparent transparency has to be held carefully because of being ancient enough and intelligent enough to manufacture grief and comfort in the impression of contact with the dead is also ancient enough and intelligent enough to know that voluntary transparency can be its own kind of manipulation. Telling someone you could deceive them but have chosen not to is itself a form of establishing trust, and established trust is a door.
Wait, so you're saying even the honesty might be a weapon?
Even the honesty might be a weapon. John Jr. apparently understood that. He never checked the boots. He didn't need to. He received what was being shown to him without letting it become something it wasn't. He didn't interpret the tracks as his father. He didn't interpret the entity's transparency as trustworthiness. It's the posture the rest of us need when we encounter things that seem to offer access to what lies beyond death. Not credulity, not flat dismissal, the willingness to look at what is being shown, understand the mechanism behind it, and refuse to let the mechanism become the message. The enemy has been making tracks in the snow for a very long time, and he has been very good at getting people to check for the boots. I think it's time we touch a little bit on the people who tried to solve the case of the Bell Witch while it was unfolding. We'll start with Mr. Williams, a professional detective who arrived from out of town with his conclusions already formed. He thought the family was manufacturing the disturbances for profit.
I like him. He sounds quite reasonable.
Yeah, I thought you might say so. Richard Bell would later note that the Bells had never charged a single cent of a single visitor. They never charged him anything.
Yeah, take that, Mr. Reasonable.
They had refused payment repeatedly. They fed everyone who came through and made sure their horses were attended to before they left. None of that information reached Mr. Williams before he arrived. I don't think he was being entirely unreasonable, but perhaps he was being overconfident. The entity apparently understood the difference better than Williams did. It stayed quiet the first night. Williams took this as confirmation. He thought whoever was behind it was too afraid to perform while he was watching. The second night, nothing happened either. He announced to the room that his suspicions were confirmed. He declared victory out loud in front of witnesses. That night, sleeping on a straw mattress on the floor, he found himself pinned down by something he couldn't see.
Wait a minute. Ain't that another Lilith thing? Don't some say that that's like a sleep paralysis demon or something?
She most certainly has been tied to that phenomenon as well. A force pressing on him with tremendous weight. Then the beating began. Invisible, methodical scratching and pounding until he screamed for help, and then it stopped. Not because someone intervened, not because it was finished. It stopped just long enough to ask him calmly which member of the family he thought was doing it.
Oh, that's gross. That's more than violence. That's a point being made right there.
That's exactly what it is. It wasn't trying to hurt him into leaving. It was making sure he understood something specific before he ever left. It waited until he had committed himself publicly to a conclusion. It let him declare victory, and then it dismantled him carefully, methodically, and paused in the middle of it to rub his face in the wreckage of his own certainty. When someone brought a light, it finally stopped. William sat in a chair with a candle beside him for the rest of that night, listening to the voice mock his investigation, asking him who he suspected, asking him how long he planned to stay. Offering sarcastic encouragement on his progress, he left at sunrise and couldn't be persuaded to stay for breakfast. What the Williams account makes clear, more clearly than any other encounter in this record, is that the entity wasn't just defeating its challengers, it was humiliating them, deliberately and methodically, with what the accounts can only describe as pleasure. It let Williams build his case. It let him commit to it. It let him win briefly, publicly in front of an audience, and then it took that victory apart, piece by piece in the dark, while he screamed and paused in the middle of it to make sure he understood the joke. That is not the behavior of something that simply wants people to leave. That's the behavior of something that wants people to know they were never in control to begin with. But Williams wasn't the only one. The Jackson account needs its own moment because it's been sitting in the background of this analysis as a punchline, and it deserves more than that.
To be fair, it has some punchline qualities.
Well, it does, and we'll get to those, but first I want to address the sourcing honestly because this is the account with the most visible hole in the record. Jackson's visit does not appear in his personal journals. Historians have noted its absence. A man who faced the British, who would become a future president of the United States, who traveled to a farm in Tennessee to investigate a talking ghost. If that happened, it was remarkable enough to write down, and as far as we know, he didn't write it down. Or if he did, it hasn't survived. That is a real problem, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise.
So most likely we're probably dealing with a story that attached itself to a famous name because famous names make stories travel further.
That is a legitimate possibility. What I'll say is that the account as Ingram preserves it has specific details that feel less like legend building and more like faithful transmission of something that has embarrassed people. Legends about famous figures tend to make those figures heroic. This account makes Jackson's entire party look frightened and makes the self-professed witch tamer among them look like a fool. That's not the typical shape of a story invented to borrow someone's credibility.
Fair point. Unflattering details tend to survive because nobody would invent them.
With that caveat on the table, the wagon. Before Jackson even reaches the Bell farm, before he has knocked on a door or spoken to a family member or given the entity any reason to know he's coming, the wagon stops on the road. The driver whips and yells. The horses strain. Jackson and his men get out and push, but nothing. They check the wheels, the ground, the harnesses. Everything appears normal, level ground, no obstructions and no explanations.
And then the voice speaks from the roadside.
From the roadside. Not from the house, not from inside a wall, but from the open road. And it addressed him by rank.
They can go now, General.
Nobody visible. The horses moved the wagon from that moment forward without difficulty. It knew who he was. It knew he was coming. It had apparently been watching the road, and it chose the moment of maximum inconvenience. Jackson and his men pushing a wagon on a public road to demonstrate that it had been aware of him the entire time. That is not the behavior of something that reacts to visitors. That's the behavior of something that was tracking the approach and chose its moment deliberately. That night, it engaged Jackson's party directly. Repeated private remarks made on the road pressed into details that it had no business knowing, and then it found the witch tamer, the man among them with the silver bullet, who had been boasting all evening, hours of it. No witch would appear while he was present, he thought. His pistol was loaded with that silver, and he intended to use it. Jackson was growing impatient. The stories had gone on for hours with no sign of the witch.
Yeah, and then the entity did exactly what it did to Williams.
Exactly what it did to Williams. It waited. It let him commit fully and publicly to his position. It let the boasting peak. And then pins. 1,000 of them, he said, all at once. He drew the pistol. It wouldn't fire. The voice told him it was standing directly in front of him. Then something slapped him across the jaw. Then something pulled his nose. He ran for the door, which opened on its own, and he sprinted to the wagon with the entity offering him unsolicited advice on the subject of witchcraft the entire way.
The advice on the way to the wagon gets me every time.
It's the detail that tells you the most about what this thing was. It wasn't satisfied with the route. It wanted the lesson delivered in full. The man ran, and the entity ran commentary all the way to the wagon, making sure he understood not just that he had lost, but exactly why and exactly how. That's the same pattern as Williams. Let them commit, let them peek, dismantle them publicly, make sure they understand the joke. And then there's Jackson, who laughed. It might be the strangest detail in the entire record. A man watches his companion get systematically humiliated, pins, slaps, nose pulling, running commentary, and his response was laughter. He told John Bell he hadn't seen anything so funny and mysterious in his life and that he'd like to stay a full week. Jackson was not a man who frightened easily, and the entity's response to his laughter is very interesting. It didn't mock him. It didn't target him. It addressed him directly and almost conversationally.
There's another fraud in your party. I'll get him tomorrow night. Go to bed, it's late.
It dismissed him politely with something that reads almost like recognition. Jackson was one person in that room who hadn't performed either fear or false confidence, and the entity apparently noticed. It told him, go to bed.
Yo, but his men didn't share his sentiments.
No, they did not. Despite Jackson wanting to stay a full week, he couldn't hold his party together for a second night. The entity had made its point efficiently. One demonstration was enough to break the resolve of everyone around him.
Now, hold on a minute. I want to go back to something you just said. You said Jackson wanted to stay a full week, right? But that's not the only version of this story that's been handed down. What about the version of this nonsense where Jackson said he'd rather fight the British again than spend another night in that house?
You're right. That is a common narrative associated with this event.
Well, then, so which is it? Because those ain't the same man. A man who lasts and wants to stay a week is a different man entirely from a man so shaken he's invoking redcoats as a point of comparison. You can't have both.
You can't have both as a single unified testimony, no, but I want to push back gently on what you're asking the contradiction to mean.
I'm asking it to mean the record ain't reliable.
That's fair, the record isn't perfectly reliable. We've already said that about the sourcing.
Wait a minute. You're not even looking at what they're actually disagreeing about. They're not saying the wagon didn't stop. Nobody's saying the guy didn't run to the wagon. Those things happen. Both versions got those things. Nobody's fighting about those events. What they can't agree on is how Jackson felt about it afterward. That's it. That's the whole contradiction. And I'm sorry, but feelings are the same thing that gets scrambled when a story passes through 10 people over 30 years. You ever play telephone as a kid? You start with the cat sat on the mat, and you end up with the president fought a raccoon. Emotions especially. Emotions get huge, or they get flipped, or they get replaced with whatever emotion makes the story land better for whoever's telling it or retelling it. That's not me defending bad sourcing. That's just how human memory works, and everybody here knows it.
Or it means someone invented one of them.
You want to talk about which version somebody invented? Think about it for 2 seconds. You got a future president of the United States, the guy who fought the British, the guy who fought everybody. He's so scared of a farmhouse in Tennessee that he's like, I'd rather go back to the actual war than spend another night in that house. That's the version that gets invented. That's the version somebody writes because it makes the Bell Witch sound like the most terrifying thing that ever existed in America ever. That story sells. That story gets repeated at every silly campfire from here to the Mississippi, but a guy who laughs, who wants to stay, who's sitting there like, this is the most fun I had in years. Can we do another week of this? Nobody invents that. That doesn't make the witch scarier. That doesn't make Jackson more heroic. That's just weird. It's inconvenient, specific little detail that doesn't fit the legend, and that is exactly why I believe it.
Vinny, that don't tell me much. Is there any nonsense out there that you don't believe?
Oh, chill out, Doc. The laughing version is stranger and harder to explain. A man watches his companion get publicly humiliated, again, pins, slaps, running, commentary all the way to the wagon, and his response is amusement. The entity responds not with escalation, but with something almost resembling courtesy. That's not a satisfying ghost story. That's an awkward, complicated detail that doesn't resolve cleanly into legend.
Yeah, remember, Doc, you said unflattering details survive.
We did, and this is a different application of the same principle. The laughing Jackson who wants to stay is unflattering to the narrative of the Bell Witch as something universally terrifying. It complicates the myth. That's exactly why it has the feel of something that survived rather than something that was constructed.
Oh my gosh, why are we still talking about this? We already said that there was no hard evidence for any of it.
We said we have no corroboration. If it did happen, the most honest reading is probably this. Jackson left. That much both versions agree on. He didn't stay the week, and whatever he said afterward, whether to the companions on the road or to Bell himself or in the retellings that branched and mutated over decades, got preserved into 2 different emotional registers. One version kept his composure, one version kept his fear. Neither version, notably, has his dismissing the experience as nothing. Whatever Andrew Jackson encountered at the Bell farm, neither tradition records him walking away unimpressed. But enough about Jackson. The conjurer deserves his own moment. What happened to him is a different kind of lesson than what happened to Williams. Williams was a skeptic who got humiliated. That's one category of mistake, the arrogance of disbelief. The conjurer represents a different and in some ways more dangerous category entirely. He believed. He came prepared. He had a method, and his method made everything worse.
I don't agree with you on any of this, but don't the fact that Mr. Bell brought some pagan conjurer on the property explain all this so-called demonic activity in your framework?
I have indeed said that involving those who are involved in the occult is a bad idea. Practicing the occult will open doors for these kinds of things, to be sure. If this was like the case of Roland Doe or Zozo, we could point to the moment where someone toyed with the occult, Ouija boards specifically in those cases. But for the Bell case, the Ouija board wouldn't be around for another 74 years. About 1891 they pop up, so we know that wasn't it.
But hold on, couldn't they have been messing around with some other kind of divination that opened doors, as you put it?
What I can say with reasonable confidence from the primary record as Ingram preserves it, there is no well-documented account of a Bell family member engaging in divination or any occult practice that directly precedes the onset of the phenomena. The Bells were a religious family. John Bell was a member of the Red River Baptist Church, and the family's piety is consistently noted across accounts. However, there are a few threads that get raised in secondary and tertiary sources. The most commonly cited is the idea that John Bell or someone on the property may have had dealings with the neighbor. Yes, that one, Kate Batts. We've looked at those accusations already. She was locally reputed to practice some form of folk magic or was considered to be a witch by community standards, but there is wasn't anything to truly nail that down. She denied it vehemently, and even Mr. Bell said she wasn't involved in any way.
Now wait a minute. Before calling the conjurer fella, did any of the multiple ministers that showed up try and exorcise the witch or whatever?
What the record confirms clearly is local ministers were called upon to expel the spirit, though none were successful. The ministers prayed, but the voice jeered, repeating biblical verses with a cruel twist. The most documented ministerial involvement was James Johnston, the family, friend, and lay Christian leader whose response after spending a night in the house was to declare it a spirit, quote, just like in the Bible, but the record doesn't show him attempting a formal confrontation or commanded expulsion. He essentially confirmed the phenomenon and then stepped back. Now here's where I need to be careful with you. One source mentions Lucy Bell attempting exorcisms, and another references Reverend James Gunn interrogating the entity and getting the name Kate Batts out of it. But the sourcing on the exorcism details specifically is thinner and appears only in secondary retellings rather than the main Ingram account. What Ingram does preserve clearly is this. The entity was not silenced by prayer. It creepily participated in it. It mimicked it, even mocked it. No minister appears in the primary record as having attempted a formal commanded expulsion in the name of Christ the way the gospel accounts describe Jesus operating, or the apostles.
Now wait a minute, don't demons possess people, not places? Even if I agreed with you, what were they supposed to do?
I'm glad you brought that up, Doc. I've been looking at that concept a lot over the last few months, and Michael Miller and I were talking about that before the Remnant episode. The idea of possession specifically is a complicated one. The word itself has been mistranslated into a corner, I fear. The Greek word used throughout the Gospels is daimonizomai, and it does not mean possessed. More specifically, it means to be demonized, to be under demonic influence or affliction. The King Jimmy translation rendered it possessed, and that word has dominated popular Christian understanding ever since, but it imported a meaning the original text doesn't carry. Possession implies total ownership and control, a demon in a person, running them kind of like a puppet. Not that this can't occur, but like so many supernatural things in the Bible, we've oversimplified it. What the gospel accounts actually show is a spectrum. The woman in Luke 13, whom Jesus identifies as bound by Satan for 18 years, she wasn't raving or violent. She was simply bent double and couldn't straighten. She was in the synagogue. She was presumably functioning in her community. She was demonized without being possessed in the Hollywood sense. Daimonizomai describes a spectrum of demonic influence rather than a binary of possessed or not possessed. That being said, the Bell household doesn't need to produce a head-spinning, levitating family member to qualify for this category. Chronic torment, targeted affliction, disruption of worship, resistance to prayer, and the systematic destruction of a specific individual are all consistent with demonization, influence, and affliction without requiring classic possession of a human host. We can go a little further into the demons only inhabit people assumption because it's been a while since this came up. The Gospels do show demonization of individuals as the most common presentation, but the text never makes the exclusive mode of demonic activity. or presence. Legion asks not to be sent out of the region, not out of the man specifically. The region itself appears to matter to them. That's territorial language, and it's in Mark 5 and Luke 8 both. Ephesians 6 is a common place we go to understand some of the architecture of demonic presence. Paul's language in Ephesians 6:12 describes powers, principalities, rulers of darkness of this age, a hierarchical structure operating in heavenly places, not exclusively in human hosts. The demonic realm in Paul's cosmology has geographic and cosmic dimensions, not just personal ones. When an unclean spirit leaves a man, as mentioned in Matthew 12, it says they wander through waterless places seeking rest and finding none. That's a disembodied spirit moving through space, not inhabiting a person. The text assumes demons can exist and operate outside of human hosts. We've talked to death about Daniel 10. It describes a malevolent spiritual entity called the Prince of Persia that delayed an angelic messenger for 21 days. It was not inhabiting a person, but exerting influence over a territory. I do believe that's something ontologically different than what we're dealing with here in Tennessee, but this is the clearest biblical precedent for location-based demonic activity, and it's hard to argue around. One more thought about Legion specifically. That was multiple entities demonizing a single individual. If that's possible, there is nothing that says multiple entities could not demonize multiple individuals. Gives you a hint of how I really feel about the Bell Witch phenomena. Getting back on track though, as far as we know, the Bell family was religious, but the religious leaders they knew were not able to do anything about this, and I believe that is in part due to the fact that they didn't think deeply enough about these things, which is precisely what we're trying to do here with the show. Shameless plug. I'm not making excuses for the Bells, but because their religious leaders largely failed them in my opinion, they got desperate and they went for help somewhere they should not have gone. It did not start the phenomenon, but it certainly added gas to the flames in my opinion. Who did they invite? Well, Dr. Mize, a noted conjurer from Simpson, Kentucky. He came to exorcise the witch and was mocked and frightened away. That's documented in Ingram. He was invited by a desperate man who had run out of ideas. Went through years of torment, a body failing, a family suffering. When you're that far gone, you'll try anything. But trying anything is exactly the problem when the anything in question is sorcery or the occult. We know the Bible has a great deal to say about those things. Deuteronomy 18 is unambiguous. The practices this conjurer was employing, the incantations, the charms, the casting out of spirits through occult methods, these are not neutral tools that can be pointed in a godly direction. They are specifically and repeatedly condemned in Scripture, not because they don't work, but because of what they connect you to when they do. When you attempt to fight a demonic entity using the kingdom of darkness's own methods, you are not bringing a weapon into the fight. You are bringing an invitation. You are essentially walking into that house and announcing that you operate in the same spiritual territory as whatever is already there, and whatever is already there knows that territory better than you do.
Wait a minute, ain't that exactly what happened? The thing didn't just beat him, it corrected him. It knew more about his craft than he did.
Exactly. That detail right there is worth sitting with. The entity didn't overpower the conjurer through superior force. It outclassed him on his own terms. We're told it named the ingredients he had left out of his charms. It identified the gaps in his preparations. It dismantled his methods from the inside with the calm authority of something that had been doing this since before the conjurer's great-grandmother was born. The conjurer arrived thinking he was bringing expertise to bear on a problem. What he was actually doing was entering a contest on his opponent's home turf, using his opponent's rulebook against an entity that wrote the rulebook. Of course he lost. He could not have won. The framework he was operating in was not designed for him to win.
Now, I still gotta ask, what should Bell have done? He was desperate, he was dying. What was the right call?
The right call was never a conjurer from Kentucky, I'll tell you that. The right call was never incantations and charm shotguns and mixed concoctions. And I want to be careful here because I'm not saying this to be glib about a man who was suffering. John Bell was a righteous man in genuine agony, and I have nothing but compassion for the position he was in, but the pattern in Scripture is consistent. When God's people turn to occult practitioners for deliverance from spiritual darkness, they do not receive deliverance, they receive deeper entanglement. Saul going to the witch of Endor in 1 Samuel 28 is the defining example. A man who had already been abandoned by God for his rebellion, reaching in desperation toward the very practices God forbidden, and finding not comfort but confirmation of his own destruction. The occult didn't save Saul, it never could. Rather, it put a period on the sentence that was already being written.
Come on, you're not saying Bell was Saul.
I'm not. I'm saying the principle holds regardless of the man. When you invite the kingdom of darkness to solve a problem caused by the kingdom of darkness, you are not solving the problem at all. You are expanding the jurisdiction. And the entity knew that. That's why it let the conjurer work for 3 days before it said anything. It wasn't afraid of him. It was letting him dig the hole deeper. 3 days of silence while the conjurer built his confidence, assembled his methods, committed himself fully to his approach, and then the entity spoke, not to flee but to lecture, not to negotiate but to demonstrate. It wasn't threatened by the charms and the incantations. It was amused by them. It knew exactly what those methods were, exactly where they fell short, and exactly how to take them apart in front of an audience. And then it sent him home on a runaway horse and narrated the whole humiliating journey to everyone back at the Bell house with what sounded like genuine enjoyment. This is the only thing that the passage reveals about the nature of what was operating in that house. It didn't just defeat its challengers, it savored defeating them. It came back and performed the defeat for an audience. There is something in the kingdom of darkness that does not merely want to win, it wants to be seen winning. It wants the humiliation witnessed and remembered and retold. That is not a personality quirk. I think that is a spiritual reality. Pride is not incidental to the enemy's nature. It is central to it. The same pride that produced the fall produced the need for an audience. And that detail that the entity needed to be seen winning, that it came back to perform the defeat for a room full of witnesses, that it ran commentary all the way to the wagon, that it narrated the conjurer's humiliating ride home with what sounds like genuine enjoyment, that detail is going to matter more than you realize when we pick this back up next week for our first 3-parter. We have not talked about what happens when the family finally stop providing an audience. We have not talked about what happened to Betsy and the witch doctor and the physical evidence that turned out to be the most strategically useful thing the entity produced in years. We have not talked about William Porter's cold night at home and what came through his door uninvited and got into his bed and waited for him. We have not yet talked about the shooting in the stable and what erupted from the walls of the house afterward. 4 voices, 4 names, 4 personalities, and what the multiplication tells us about what actually was operating on that farm. We have not talked about a field and a log by the road and a man on his knees in the dirt asking God if it's possible for that cup to pass, and the long walk home that followed. And we have not yet wrapped up the case about a man named Smith who arrived in Robertson County in 1875 with no history anyone could verify and no family anyone could name, who told 2 men that his abilities came from the Bell Witch, and who those 2 men killed rather than remain under his influence because the Bell Witch didn't need to be in the room anymore. It had already done its work. Some things leave a place when they're done with it, and some things leave something behind that does the work for them. Robertson County learned the difference the hard way. Next week, we'll learn a little bit more about that. Part 3 is coming, folks. Thank you for listening. I also want to thank those of you who are praying for me. Your prayers are needed now more than ever. With all the new listeners coming out, there's a whole new level of attack, spiritual and otherwise. I'm not going to lie, I've been stalking the comments section of Remnant Radio just to see how folks were receiving the material I shared. 80% of it seems positive, 5% of it is strange and incoherent nonsense, and the other 15% is just straight malice. Many of you already know that YouTube and social media, well, they don't typically bring out the best of the body of Christ. Many professing Christians get absolutely awful on the internet, especially with the benefit of anonymity. Those that disagree with me on there don't offer biblical arguments. They jump straight to attacking my character. Again, not surprising, but with my tiny little footprint that has been relatively minimal until now. I'm not looking for sympathy, friends, but I'm asking for prayer. May God grant me thick skin if it pleases Him to elevate my platform. Please share this episode. Tell somebody about it. That's the only way people are going to find out about the show. If you want to help me continue to do big deep dives like this one, join the Toasties on Patreon. Help me keep the lights on. Links for everything, as always, are in the show notes. I want to thank you all for listening today to The Dancing Toaster, wherever you're listening. Like, share, subscribe, comment, leave me a review, follow, do all the things wherever you consume The Dancing Toaster, but whatever you do, don't consume toasters, and don't let any mysterious spirits consume you. I love you. I'm out.
Report suspicious activities and call 911 for immediate response. Expect delay. Traffic delays and restrictions. Take personal security precautions to avoid becoming a victim of an attack. Avoid crowded public areas and gatherings. Do not travel to areas affected by the attack or in a known area elevated virus activity. Keep emergency supplies accessible and a full tank of gas at all times.
Be careful.
Government officials insist that this is isolated and significant of the packet for anyone. Okay, well, perhaps we will continue to keep you informed regarding this story.